Tony Blair. Remember Tony Blair? Well, according to newly released documents, the former Labour leader backed returning the Elgin marbles to Greece as a sort of a bargaining chip to boost London's bid for the 2012 Olympics. Discussing this and more of this morning's biggest political stories, commentator Jonathan Lis. Morning to you, Jonathan.
Morning, Ian.
Good to see you. Can we say Happy Christmas? We can still do that, can't we?
Of course we can. Happy Christmas, Happy New Year.
Happy New Year, all of the above. Did any of this surprise? There's a couple of Blair stories to look into.
Yeah.
I mean, the Elgin marbles thing didn't really surprise me because I could imagine that being a discussion. Look, you know, is there a way, would this help our bid for the Olympics, etc.? I would imagine the Labour government were quite relaxed about whether they kept them in the museum in this country or whether they went back to Greece.
Well, as it turned out, the Labour policy publicly throughout was that they would stay in Britain, so that actually hasn't been.
But behind the scenes?
Behind the scenes in government, things are always being discussed. And actually, and I say this obviously as a critic of the Conservative government, I think it's important that people should be able to voice ideas without being ridiculed. Obviously, some ideas are ridiculous, and when they get in the papers, the people who make them look ridiculous. But I do think it's important that civil servants and officials should have the courage and confidence to sort of think, you know, so-called outside the box. The thing that matters, Ian, and this is really important for this conversation, is whether those ideas then make it past the drafts folder. If they actually then make it, you know, to the Prime Minister's desk, if they then make it into sort of, you know, the media round. And that, I think, is the difference between what we're talking about now and some of the more outlandish things, I say that generously, that have happened in the last couple of years with regards to asylum.
Well, obviously the big headline, I mean, for me, the standout thing, and you're right, because the first thing I thought about when I saw this stuff about immigration was that, well, it didn't happen anyway, so you're correct. That's exactly what civil servants and advisors should do. They should think outside the box. They should be honest with prime ministers, sometimes uncomfortable with prime ministers, and throw all the options out there. This is what is available to you, and then the prime minister will say, well, yes, no, maybe, etc. However, Jonathan Powell was a little more than just a civil servant. I mean, he was a big advisor. He was as close to the prime minister as he could be. And he and his team came up with quite a lot of immigration proposals that are very, very similar to what the Conservative government are talking about now. Yeah,
and I'd have rejected and objected them just as vociferously then as I do the Conservative government's proposals now. I think that none of them, we have to say that none of them goes as far as what the Tories are proposing and are legislating for at the moment. There was no kind of permanent deportation plan, such as Rwanda. There was a plan for offshore processing, which is what Australia's been doing for many years. I think that's actually quite an inhuman policy if you look at what's happened in Nauru, etc. But that was something the government was proposing. They were talking about sort of, you know, situated people on the Isle of Mull, which is sort of like a more like a domestic Rwanda situation, not to deport, but to kind of process, etc. They were talking about moving some refugees and asylum seekers to countries nearby if they were failed, I think it was. You know, some Somalis to Kenya, I think, was being discussed. I think there were some discussions with Tanzania for offshore processing. Again, different from Rwanda in the sense that that would have been for processing, not for permanent deportation.
But if the overarching argument is meant to be sort of one of ethical or moral considerations, they kind of amount to the same thing. But supposedly what we keep hearing from often people like yourself, and I say that respectfully, is that actually, you know, these are very vulnerable people. We shouldn't be considering any of this stuff sending anyone to anywhere.
If I'd been in government at that time, and I was mercifully too young, I would not have been proposing these measures because I don't agree with them fundamentally. Obviously, you know, you have your personal hat and your professional hat on. Personally, I'm opposed to all of them. Professionally, you know, the government, if the Prime Minister asks you to think outside the box and to search for even more radical options, I think is what the wording that Blair used, then obviously his officials are then tasked with doing that. And there was one proposal, which thankfully was not taken forward, which was to kind of, you know, sort of leave the asylum system altogether.
To have no asylum policy,
basically to go against international law, to basically sort of provoke other countries, which then was decided would have a disastrous backlash from other countries. And there was also one idea, which was that, you know, to say that because people had come from other countries, if they'll come to Britain, ergo, which is such a ridiculous argument, which we've talked about many, many times on this programme. You know, for one, also, not just because of solidarity and because it's not fair that the first port of call should take all of the responsibility, but if there was some kind of global crisis to some mythical place to our west, And there was a huge refugee crisis from there. And the first port of call those people were coming to was Britain. I don't think that a lot of right-wing people in Britain will be saying, you know what, fair enough, Britain is the first safe country these people are coming to. So France, Italy, Spain, Netherlands, Belgium, don't need to take any of them because they come to Britain and Britain is the first safe country. Of course they wouldn't be saying that. They were saying that this is a global crisis, this is a crisis that's happening on our doorstep. Everyone needs to take their share.
But we did do that. We did that with Ukraine. We did to an extent with Hong Kong as well. With Ukraine, people... And the reason, Jonathan, people were relaxed about Ukraine was because they could see the problem. They could see...
because they were white Christians.
It was... I don't think it's because they were white Christians.
I think it was because that, partly.
You think that's what it was, because they were white people?
That was certainly one of the main reasons. I'm not saying that...
I mean, there are some Ukrainians that would argue that white is the wrong word to define their...
What we did in Ukraine
pigmentation, if that's the
What we did, there were Christian white Europeans. What we did in Ukraine was absolutely the right thing to do. In fact, we should have done more of that, because countries like Poland took far more of the responsibility than Britain did. And we were actually quite late off the blocks in processing refugees. If you remember, last year, there were all kinds of problems and delays, and people had to go through embassies and all this kind of stuff, where other countries streamlined the system. But in the end, we got there pretty much. But we are not doing that for, say, Sudanese refugees right now. Even countries where we've had sort of official schemes to get people here safely and legally, such as Afghanistan, it's been sort of in the low hundreds, I think, of people who've actually been able to come here through that scheme. We simply have not done our bit globally.
It isn't because they're white Christians, John.
Well, I happen to think, well, no, I don't know.
Yes, but your politics drives you to that kind of slightly wayward belief system.
You might think it's wayward.
You're a left-winger, therefore you are fundamentally slightly flawed. I think we can establish that. Would that be fair?
I don't think that I would
Would that be fair?
I don't think that would be
just
fair.
a little bit fair. I'm saying that in the spirit of Christmas.
Absolutely. But of course, I would never dream of being so rude and flipping the tables on you.
Actually, my point is, I think people. I don't think it was about white Christians. I think it might have been about a cultural recognition. Right? We understand these people come from a very similar culture to us. We also understand that there is a war going on European turf. I think that was a driving force, and we understand the need to... When you start to get into Sudan or Somalia or Eritrea, I think it's very hard to understand the thinking, the reasoning, what's going on. Some places we're not at war with, some places we've had no involvement.
I'm not saying it's the only reason, but I'm saying there is a reason why Poland is very, very happy to take Ukrainians and not at all happy to take any brown people. And I think that we have to be honest about that.